And I'm a creativity consultant and founder of my own design consultancy firm, Deduce Designs. And today I'll be sort of chatting with you all a little bit about my own experience in information sciences, specifically my background as a data scientist as well as a user experience researcher and designer. I'll be answering some of your questions about the fields and talking a little bit about my own experience and sort of where I see the fields going. So just as some background, I want to greet all of the information science students in Professor Ammari's graduate and undergraduate classes at Rutgers. It's because of your questions that we're doing these talks in the first place. I really appreciate all the questions that you sent and hope that these stories can help you navigate the field of information science regardless of sort of the path you take in this discipline. I want to give a specific shout out to Ehi, Maxwell, Ryan, Tyler, Hayoon, Jacob, and Eric and Thomas for your specific questions, which I'm hoping to answer in the videos below. This is just my experience, and I hope that it helps. But with everything in life, I'll just add this disclaimer that you can take what you like and leave the rest. My plan here is to record one continuous talk that I'll then break up into smaller sections for those of you who want to skip around. And specifically, I'll be going into kind of my background and how I got into the information sciences. I'll be giving specific career advice for those information science students who are interested in data science and user experience design. And then kind of more lastly, I'll be giving some general life advice about the discipline of information sciences, and how to kind of think about your early career and ways to get started. And hopefully some other nuggets of wisdom sort of scattered along the way. And hopefully there's something in here that's helpful. If in any one of these videos I didn't specifically answer a question that you had, please feel free to respond in the comments. I'll be following these videos. I'm happy to offer any advice or perspective that I uniquely have. So with that, let's get started with the questions. How did you get into data science and user experience? What path did you take? I think this question is really relevant because it wasn't a direct path that I followed. The truth is, I feel like I kind of fell into this role. And looking back, I can see a lot of what at the time felt like seemingly random choices I made were at crucial points that led me down a path towards information sciences, which I frankly imagine is true for a lot of you. And what I mean by that is that I don't think that there's only one way to get to data science or even to user experience design. And I actually kind of think that that's a strength of information science. I think it's a real strength that you have students who have backgrounds in history or foreign languages or economics or who maybe did completely different experiences at other points in their life. I think this is a huge strength of our discipline, is that we use the processes and tools in this discipline to integrate lots of different varying perspectives in order to find a holistic solution. So for me, specifically, the slippery slope started in a high school debate club called Fed Challenge. For those of you that are unfamiliar, this is a competition where super nerds in high school make presentations to the economists at the regional Federal Reserve banks, which are the United States version of a central bank. And whichever high school team makes the strongest case for a specific monetary policy wins. I'm not gonna lie to you, like my friends and I on this team, we would read the financial newspapers every single day to take in all the new data. What were the employment numbers doing? What's inflation doing? How are our trade numbers doing? In order to help us over time kind of build a case for what monetary policy we would make recommendations for. And I can't even begin to describe to you how cool I thought that was. Here we were, students, just using the power of rational, logical arguments. We're making cases for specific monetary policy. Only instead of being evaluated by other students, like you might see in a regular debate club, we were trying to convince actual economists at the Fed on the monetary policy that they should apply. Mind completely blown. And in doing these presentations, you also got to see that different teams highlighted different information. We all technically had the same resources. All of this information that we were basing our assessments on was public knowledge. It's just what facts and figures each team chose to highlight or weigh as more important than another was, completely dependent upon that team's interpretation. So this was kind of like my first experiences with really thinking critically about data and information in a practical, real-world sense. So much of modern education is really teaching young people to take in information and make arguments, but I was seeing how the numbers I was reading in the newspaper applied to real life and death, in some cases, situations with respect to monetary policy in the United States. And I absolutely adored the idea of teenagers challenging professionally trained economists about what monetary policy should be. It showed me that at some level, information is subjective and subject to be interpreted based on what was available. It taught me to be critical about the data sources as well, and to look beyond sort of the superficial meaning of what was being presented. A great example of that is the employment numbers in the United States. So what gets reported are like the absolute number of jobs that were increased in a week, or the percentage of employed or unemployed people out of the total workforce. But, as you can imagine, right now we're living through a global pandemic. The total available workforce is counted based on who is actively seeking a job, based on unemployment rolls. But, we're in a humongous downturn. Just because you want a job might not necessarily mean that you can find a job. There are ways in which the underlying statistics that we currently use to measure our economy, have small faults in them. The numerators and the denominators, unless you really understand where the percentage is coming from, there are ways in which it can be misconstrued, and is often misconstrued in media sources. So here I am, like a budding 17-year-old, and I'm having my mind blown on a daily basis about what is real? How does this number make sense anymore? And really getting to see how my own understanding of where the data sources was coming from would help strengthen an argument that I was making about a specific policy route. Because ultimately the monetary policy, while it's not maybe as sexy as fiscal policy or tax policy or any of these other things, we know, having lived through the financial crisis as well, these have big impacts on how businesses run and how they work. It's not something to sniff at, and it was something that really, because I was looking at it so closely at that time, I really got to see, I felt like I was looking inside of the machine. So basically from that moment on, I set my sights to become an economist and work at the Fed, which is, looking back in hindsight, is such a ridiculous thing for a teenager to say. Is this is what I'm doing for the rest of my life. But I was single-minded and single-focused on achieving this objective, and I did it. And there are so many stories I could relate, things I've learned kind of in hindsight about how that sort of single-focused way of looking at my undergraduate degree, there were a lot of opportunities that I potentially missed because I was looking so strong and so hard at this one way, this one thing, this is the one goal I had. But we'll kind of touch upon that later. Suffice it to say that my interest in data at this point had always been about understanding factual information and how to inform better decision making based on what was available. So in my undergraduate degree, the thing I gravitated more towards, thinking about this very social policy bent young person that I focused on development economics. I felt like there was a lot of good in the world that could be done by better understanding fundamental systems, individual decision-making, how that played out in behavioral economics, as well as sort of larger public policies that could be enacted. I was a policy nerd. I wanted to make the world better. So this single focused objective landed me as a research analyst at first in the Fed's emerging markets department. So I felt like I'd landed in clover. I got exactly the job that I wanted. What hadn't quite sunk in through my entire undergraduate degree, in studying philosophy and in studying theory and in studying policy and all the rest of it, the practical application of economics in the real world looked a hell of a lot more like this. Building, or honestly more likely repairing, the Excel macros that other econometric calculations that some previous analyst had built. It was a naughty nest of nastiness, variables, loops, conditional statements, and heaven knows what other kinds of transformations had been left behind, and heaven knows whether they actually commented what transformations they did and how they were calculated. While I was working in the field that I wanted to work in, and while I was working towards taking some additional master's classes while I worked in order to start an economics PhD, I found that most of my time was actually spent programming unintentionally, like unintentional consequence right there. The math department that I was taking graduate classes also offered computer science classes. And given how much of my time was spent trying to muck through the weeds of other people's transformational data scripts, I felt like, hell, I'll just take a couple computer science courses, at least get a basic understanding of what programming is, to see if that wouldn't make my life, my day-to-day life, easier. What I hadn't anticipated, though, was just how much I actually enjoyed programming. I don't know, it just felt more practical. I was taking graduate level calculus and linear algebra classes or learning C++. In terms of real world lived experience, I was finding much more value in my C++ class than I was in linear algebra. Not to knock linear algebra, pretty fucking cool subject. And some of you may relate to this, I have never really thought of myself as a big math nerd. So those courses, especially the upper level theoretical math, it felt like it was taking me further away from the reasons why I'd started an economics degree in the first place, which was to help people. Coming up with theories based on calculus that had no connection to reality, right? They were just fancy formulas that were based off of musings in an economics paper. That wasn't why I got into this. Whereas programming, seeing how transforming the data, helping make sense of large numbers and data sets, I could immediately see what the practical application of that was in my day-to-day policy work with the economists at the Fed. And kind of especially because I was so skeptical already about data sources and where information was coming from, learning computer science, getting deeper and deeper into the weeds of computer science, how machines think, how they make sense of the information, really felt like I was opening up a black box. And that made me even more skeptical about demanding to know where my data was stored, how it was protected, how it was being used, which was great because I was at an institution at the time where we had reams and reams of access to government data. And it gave me the opportunity, through helping the economists with their research projects, to really drill down into questions like, how was this information collected? Who was it collected from? On what time frame was it? Is this daily data, monthly data, quarterly, annual data? That has implications for the sensitivity of your results. So I was getting this great education, kind of twofold, in terms of seeing more specifically how my interests in data were evolving as I was working. So not only was I deepening my understanding of how I was making sense of data science, which I wasn't even really calling it then, I was just more of a data monger, data analyst, but all this was happening in the backdrop of some amazing and tremendous world experiences happening through the Federal Reserve. I was covering the oil markets at a time when Hurricane Katrina and Rita hit, which was the beginning of the rise for oil prices to over $100 per barrel. I was helping cover the mortgage industry just as the subprime mortgage crisis was starting to show signs of distress. I also was involved in interbank relationships across the central banks globally as the Lehman Brothers firm collapsed and our whole sort of global financial system was thrown into chaos. In terms of like first jobs and like first work experiences, it was unparalleled in terms of the experiences and the exposure that I got. And I think, we don't all have to live through crises to like learn something deep, but it really fostered in me this deep desire to kind of want to get at core understandings of things and to see specifically how policymakers had to make decisions based on the information they had, not on the information they wanted. And finding data sources to make sense of something that was ongoing or you were in the middle of, I got to see sort of firsthand what the limitations were on even big government organizations. So it was an eye-opening experience to kind of get a sense of, I think, healthy skepticism about what even large organizations are able to do if they aren't prepared to be collecting the information that they need to make nimble and quick decisions. Sort of one last thing I really want to highlight about my time with the economists at the Fed is, up until that point, I sort of was gung-ho about like, I want to be a PhD in economics, but the work in the computer science department was really starting to pique my interest, and I was seeing that maybe there was more available to me than what I had kind of originally thought. And something else that I learned from the economists at the Fed that I will forever, hold in my heart as like one of the greatest lessons that the economists ever taught me was they would frequently, they would be writing papers for conferences or journals or what have you. And so they would hold workshopping events where someone would come to present their preliminary research in order to get input and feedback from the other economists. And mind you, the economists in the research department, spanned a whole range of different disciplines, right? So they were covering different types, macroeconomics, microeconomics, the financial markets, the mortgage markets, so they all had different perspectives. And that was really helpful for these workshopping opportunities because they could point out things that maybe the author wasn't aware of. And so invariably in these workshopping sessions, almost without fail, the first questions that would come up to the author would be about the data set and what assumptions they were making when determining the independent and dependent variables of their models. So like quick snapshot is in econometrics, you're trying to show sort of what is the strength of the influence of some criteria on another. So, examples would be like, what does gender or race have an influence on your salary? Might be an econometric model that you would build, right? And so the independent variables of race and gender would be applied to the dependent variable of your salary to see how it varied, right? What was great about these workshopping opportunities would you would see these like titans of thought sort of going head to toe with one another about, well, I challenge you on that data set. I challenge you on the numbers you chose. I challenge you on why you built the model in this way. What underlying assumptions were you making as you were choosing these particular independent or dependent variables? First off, it's always amazing when you can see people respectfully disagree with one another. I think it's a really important skill to develop, the thick skin of understanding that when people are challenging your work, it's not because they dislike you. It actually is because they want to strengthen what you're doing. They want to provide an opportunity to see your work in a different perspective and then hopefully help you grow from that. But then also, I walked away from the experience understanding deeply that whether I was aware of it or not, my research or my arguments were always based on some certain assumptions. And if I wasn't willing to look or become aware of the assumptions I was making in any of my assessments, I would be in some ways blind to the constraints that story I was telling, well, it's got to be this way. And it's like, well, maybe it wasn't. And how am I going to challenge what I assume is true? So Suffice it to say, that my time at the Fed taught me a lot, especially about challenging my assumptions. Maybe I didn't need to be a PhD in economics. Maybe there were other ways of thinking about data sets. Maybe, maybe these weren't all the gold standards. Maybe there were challenges that I could place on things. And this is kind of the backdrop and the setup for plot twist. As with all good stories, just as I was feeling like I was starting to get a handle on something about my career or something about where I was going, my then partner got 2 years of funding to go to finish his PhD research in India. And at this time, I studied development economics. I was training to be an economist, and I was learning computer scientist. And I was like, I can't see the downside just spending 2 years in India when this is my background. I'm sure this will, there's bound to be something that I'll learn from this. And boy, was that true. It was probably one of the most life-altering experiences that I'd had. It was fantastic and tremendous, but it was also really challenging socially and culturally. India was like a 90-degree angle from like anything I'd experienced. And at that point in my life, I'd traveled sort of extensively in Europe, and I thought that, oh, Europe is so exotic. I really had no idea, which was really, at 26 years old, that was like a really good shakeup for me to get. Hey, Nikki, your assumptions about the way that the world works, about the way that things are done, about the way that society's organized, well, they do it differently here. And why not learn about that a little bit more? I didn't have a specific role outlined for myself at the start of those 2 years. So instead, I volunteered at various nonprofits around the country, billing myself as a monitoring and evaluation intern. Monitoring and evaluation, for just a little bit of context, is actually all nonprofits that are receiving money from donors need to report back their results, right? And unlike, say, a for-profit company, which will release their annual reports, show their profit margins, their total assets, nonprofits also measure the results that they're getting. Effectively, I was billing myself as a glorified bean counter, which, let's be honest, I kind of was. I was happy to mung around in the data and play with their data sets and apply some of the skills I'd been learning at the Fed and in my computer science degree to see if I could help these organizations out. Again, I studied development economics. My interest really was in being socially minded, and so this just felt like kind of a natural fit. But keep in mind, at this point, I am a pretty entitled little snot who's used to working in the developed world, having access to electricity, running water, and the internet 24/7. And when I got to India, all of my assumptions about my working conditions and what would be available to me just threw them completely out the window. It was a real eye-opener to see how a lot of organizations had to work on the ground. It showed me that beans weren't being counted in exactly the same way in different places. And so, kind of, what do I mean by that? It just felt like the reality that we were experiencing on a day-to-day basis didn't match up with donor expectations about what types of outcomes we should be able to get. One of my favorite examples of this time was one of the nonprofits I was working with was trying to help farmer cooperatives. So gatherings of, large groups of thousands of farmer families, organizing them to help them en masse sell their produce to food manufacturers. A collective of tomato farmers would be shipping all of their tomatoes to a ketchup factory. And then this would be sort of a beneficial arrangement for both parties because the farmers would have a consistent supplier to send their resources to. And then the supplier would have the guarantee that the quality level from this collective, which we would be supporting, would be of a certain value, right? And then the farmers themselves wouldn't have to worry about the vagaries of the local consumer market. Win-win, right? It was going to work for everybody. But in looking at some of the numbers that our donors were asking for, one of the ones that really confounded me was we had to demonstrate that over a 3-year period, there was a 5% decrease in food spoilage year on year. And it's like, how do I measure spoilage? You know, like, do I ask the farmers to calculate how many tomatoes they have on their truck at the start of their journey to the processing plant, and then how many tomatoes have spoiled by the time that they get there? Like, are they doing this on a piece of paper? Like, how am I collecting that information? Where does this come from, right? This is not an easy ask. I find out subsequently that the question was intended to understand whether we had helped them collectively organize cold storage refrigerator trucks to transport the food so that the food wasn't spoiling in transit. But that wasn't the question that they asked. The question they asked was the percentage of food spoilage. Because let's be honest, like, showing that you decrease spoilage on like a donor pamphlet or on some high glossy magazine that institution produces sounds way sexier than we hired 3 cold storage trucks. And I was beginning to see, and keep in mind, I worked at a bunch of different nonprofits when I was in India, and it was sort of the same story over and over again. The requirements of what was being asked for them. In one case, this non-governmental organization, where they were only allowed to use X percentage of the money to fund a person. So this was only, the salary of 3/4 of a person was being funded by this grant, and the other 1/4 was being funded by that grant. And, these 5 computers were funded by this grant, and the other 7 computers were from this. I mean, it was just a nightmare to keep track of what monies were being applied to what. You consider the fact that nonprofits pretty much have their hands tied a lot of the times by what outcomes they're trying to produce, the social outcomes. And like, you hear all this talk about like, well, the operational cost of that nonprofit is, blah, 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 blah. And then you're actually inside of it and you see how many times their hands are being tied behind their back. I'd volunteered at nonprofits before. I'd never been in the inner guts of it before. And this was an inkling and eye-opening for me about, hey, wait a second, there's something wrong about the way that we're trying to evaluate nonprofits. There's a mismatch here. There's a real mismatch between the information that's accessible that could demonstrate value and like what are the needs of the donor institutions. Not to mention the fact that spending time in the developing world, really spending time there, the numbers that were being calculated in some of these development economic reports and papers that I'd been reading for so long in school, about experiments that were being done on poor families to assess how likely they were to repay a loan, for example. Oh, well, if these situations and these circumstances, this family is 50% less likely to repay a small microloan versus if the conditions are like this. And so we've optimized how to do microlending by blah, blah, blah. And these are real families. Like, these are real people living in poverty. And there were these assessments that were being played on the independent and dependent variables of their circumstances that would determine how likely they were to be a good person to lend to. And when you're really there and you're really seeing how some people suffer and just how the disparities of inequality, opportunity, income, health, it was really raking on my soul that there was a disconnect here between how the Western world was looking at the developed world, how we were measuring it, how we were assessing impact. At this point, like, my gut is like all fired up and I'm like, I have to answer this question. And I'm on my way back to the United States after 2 years in India. And I'm thinking to myself, do I really want to go back to the Fed? Do I want to go back to my computer science degree? Computer science is so fixated on how the machine works. It wouldn't really let me explore this question of data and information and assessment the way that I really felt like I needed to. I was like, do I do a public policy degree? I mean, like, but it's not really technical enough, and it's not talking about the sources of data information. I was like, where do I fit? You know, I was applying to like schools all over the country because I didn't really know. By the grace of a power greater than myself, someone pointed out to me the information science program at the University of Michigan, which had an entire discipline dedicated to community informatics. This was a school that had been really based in library sciences, and so it was a community of thought leaders who were really thinking about how do we use information in a way to better people's lives. I would never have thought of information sciences because up until that point, I didn't really know what it was. And I would offer that at the time that I was starting to transition to it, it was becoming more and more of an issue. You know, people understood what user experience was. It was becoming, it was a part of the zeitgeist now. And I think what gets so interesting about sort of transitioning into like a degree that really fit for me, right? Like was it economics? Was it computer science? And then like I found my intellectual home in the information sciences department because this was finally actually what if we go all the way to the beginning of my story, was what I was looking into, which was how to make information more accessible. So although I ostensibly came into school as a data science student, I kept being drawn into the user experience courses on research and behavioral design because that nugget of like wanting to make the data more intelligible, wanting to make it more accessible. And again, what is a whole lot easier to see in hindsight was that it was this combination of data science and user experience design that I was beginning to specialize in information visualizations, trying to help users make sense of very large, very complex data sets. To me, that marriage between data science and user experience felt incredibly obvious, especially in the rapidly expanding data-centric world that we're all living in right now. Data illiteracy felt like this huge problem that was only going to continue to get worse over time unless we found a way to help humans grasp the data involved, where it came from, to think critically about the data sources or inherent biases within the data sets, as well as things like privacy and security and how that information could be manipulated or used to manipulate us. So to me, this understanding that data science can lend to where the information is coming from, combined with user experience design's focus on how we make sense of information. I mean, it just seemed very perfect to me. So the too long didn't read of that like very long-winded answer to the question of my background and how I got into this is really to kind of highlight the following things. I don't think that there's one perfect path to take in order to become an information scientist. Whether you're in data science or user experience or library sciences, I actually think that the diversity of backgrounds in our discipline is what makes our discipline stronger. We come at problems from different perspectives, and if you can see yourself and your experiences as kind of fitting into that, I think you'll always value the diversity, the range of diversity of thought we have in this discipline. Another thing to consider is like you can't make a mistake with your career if you're continuing to choose things that you enjoy. Each one of these choices, I mean, I can say in hindsight that like, oh, look, it seems so like perfect and linear. At the time, I felt like I was like losing, I was randomly choosing, oh, I'll do computer science, and now I'll go to India, and now I'll do this other, like, at the time, it just felt like I was groping in the dark for what would make sense to me. But I always kept following that nugget of something that interested me. I would offer that like you can't make a mistake if you continue to follow what you want to explore and what you want to uncover. You know, and we're about to transition into sort of the next section of this talk, but worry less about if you have the right skills to do the job and ask yourself whether you can actually see yourself enjoying that job. When I was working at the Fed and I was taking grad classes in math, I'll be honest, I was looking at these classes and I was looking at how they were asking me to think. And it was the beginning of me really questioning whether I wanted to do an econ PhD. Again, like I said, I'm not a humongous math person. I was willing to do it for the goal of becoming an economist. But what I saw was I felt like I was being asked to abstract myself so far away from what I had originally intended to do the degree for, right? I was like, every level of abstraction was taking me further and further away from policy and people and real world outcomes. I felt like it was drawing me away from reality. And that's how I think I slipped into computer science, was because it felt much more influential, because it was actually using scripts to transform data that was being used by economists to understand the world. I could see the real world implications. And so I veered in that direction. Follow what feels right and what feels more natural to you. Obviously there are going to be times where you're going to have to learn things that don't feel comfortable, but I think there's a distinction between something that's uncomfortable because you're trying to learn it versus being pulled in a direction of thought that doesn't conform to how you understand the world and how you make sense of things. And I'd offer kind of your unique perspective on the world. If you're being asked further and further to remove how you understand things, I think that's naturally going to cause some friction for you. So to kind of wrap that up, this section up, you'll see that I was kind of forging my own path. I was kind of making my way through this all. And even though, after grad school, I'd effectively made it in the profession, I was able to call myself a data scientist, I was doing interaction design and user research, I was still kind of challenging and questioning what space I wanted to carve out for myself, given the state of the actual world that we lived in, and not the vision that the ivory tower of academia was presenting. Sorry, Professor Ammari. My desire to kind of push myself in this field further eventually led me to starting my own consulting company. And after some trial and error, I've landed on working as a creativity coach and consultant. And I chose that path because this is where my natural strengths lie. And I'm leaning into that. I'm leaning into the part of the work and the elements of the work that not only do I find more enjoyable and pleasurable, but frankly, I know that I have a unique talent for. And that doesn't mean that this is done or over, or that my career, I've plateaued and I've reached the pinnacle. I don't know. I don't know what I'll be doing 5 years from now. This pandemic has created such an opening for a change and possibility. I imagine that I'll be doing something entirely different 2 or 3 years from now. And that'll be good, right? I know that about myself. I know that constant questioning, investigation, and challenging has led me not only to grow as a professional, but personally as well. And I just want to keep trying. But I have more to say on that later. Thank you so much for following me along this video so far. If you're interested in learning more about my career advice, specifically to information science students, data science, user experience design students, just head over to part 2. And if you're interested in hearing more about my thoughts on the field of information science and how information science professionals can think about their life and their career outside of school, head over to part 3. Look forward to seeing you there. And with that, I just want to say a big, giant thank you to all the students in Professor Ammari's classes for your questions. They were wonderful and insightful, and a great opportunity for me to look back and think on my own experiences and reflect on some of the lessons I've learned. Please feel free to drop me any comments, questions you have. I'd love to hear from you, especially as you go on into your careers. I look forward to hearing more about your adventures.